"You're under citizen's arrest for chicken terrorism." That's what she screamed across the fence at 5:32 a.m., still in her glittery robe, clutching a Starbucks mug like it was a grenade. I was holding a half-eaten apple and a shovel, halfway through feeding my cows. The only other sound in the early dawn was my old rooster Rusty crowing from the coop. Karen, the queen of overreaction and self-declared HOA general, was filming with her phone and pointing dramatically like she was on some live courtroom drama. I stood there silently chewing, watching her call 911 with wild eyes, not even realizing she was calling the sheriff's department. I wiped the dirt off my hand, walked back inside, slipped on my uniform, and by the time I pulled up in the cruiser to the front gate, she was yelling, "Arrest this man." To me, the sheriff. Karen had moved in 3 months ago from the city and had been on a mission to civilize the countryside ever since. She bought the last house on the far end of our road, a newly renovated farmhouse with just enough distance from the town to feel rural, but apparently not enough to accept the reality of actual rural life. The sound of tractors offended her, the smell of manure made her file complaints, and now the crowing of an elderly rooster had apparently crossed some imaginary line. Her face that morning was bright red, a mix of rage and concealer, and her phone was recording vertically. Typical. I didn't say anything when I arrived. I simply parked the cruiser, stepped out, and adjusted my hat. Karen blinked. The realization hit her so slowly I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. She looked at my badge, my name tag, then back at my face. She stuttered a bit, then scoffed and said, "This is a conflict of interest." I calmly asked her what the emergency was, already knowing exactly what the dispatcher had told me. According to her, my rooster had been taunting her by crowing directly at her house and issuing vocal threats, whatever that meant. I gave her a polite nod and walked past her toward my fence line. I pointed at the coop. Rusty was asleep again. I turned back around and told her, "Ma'am, that rooster's older than TikTok. He barely wakes up, let alone plans coordinated vocal assaults." She looked like she was about to explode, her whole body trembling like a soda can before the pop. She stomped back to her house, yelling something about suing me and taking it to the media. I waved. That's when I knew Karen had gone too far. This wasn't her first stunt. She'd been pushing the limits for weeks, and the neighborhood was starting to fracture over it. A few of the HOA folks actually feared her, afraid of getting fined for absurd things like having hay bales too close to their porch or hanging wind chimes she didn't approve of. She'd filed noise complaints against my tractor during harvest week and once left a passive-aggressive note in my mailbox that read, "Some of us enjoy silence and order. Be a better neighbor," signed with a lipstick kiss. I'd thrown it straight into the compost pile where it belonged. Karen, you see, wasn't technically even the HOA president. She found a loophole, claimed she was interim head after the last one moved to Arizona, and since nobody else wanted the job, she took it upon herself to act like she ruled the land. But now she had dialed 911 over a rooster. That was my line in the sand. I decided not to go nuclear just yet. Instead, I logged the complaint officially, took some photos of the fence and the coop, and submitted a report stating that the call had no legal grounds. It would sit quietly in the system, but the best part, her voice and call transcript were recorded evidence. Later that afternoon, I saw her pacing up and down her porch like a military general inspecting troops. She had binoculars. No joke. She scanned my property like she was preparing for war, then stormed inside, only to emerge 10 minutes later with a clipboard and measuring tape. I watched her from my porch as she measured the width of my driveway entrance, then paced off distances between my barn and the tree line. I guess she was looking for violations of HOA aesthetic regulations. I got a call from my neighbor Hank later that day. Hank was a retired postal worker who kept to himself and brewed his own beer. He told me Karen had stopped by his house with a printed packet titled Farm Property Optimization Guidelines, which looked like something she typed up herself. Inside were notes about banning scarecrows, controlling livestock noises, limiting tractor usage to daylight hours only, and my personal favorite, a section about enforcing rooster curfews. Hank had laughed so hard he choked on his beer, But the real kicker came 2 days later. I found my official county mailbox torn out and replaced with a white and gold metal monstrosity bearing the HOA logo and a tiny slot labeled Karen's Complaints Only. That right there, that's a federal offense. Tampering with a sheriff's mailbox. That was the moment I decided this wasn't going to end with just patience and tolerance. It was time to respond, not as a farmer, but as the law. I took my time though. No need to rush a good plot. First, I set up new security cameras across my property. Then I went through the footage from the past week. Sure enough, there she was, sneaking up to the coop at 4:50 a.m., shining a flashlight at the rooster, probably trying to provoke him into crowing. I had her on tape trespassing, harassing livestock, and oh yes, stealing one of my scarecrows, which later appeared on her lawn wearing a pink sun hat. I submitted everything into the incident system and flagged it. I wasn't going to press charges yet. No, not yet. This was about principle now. Karen had called the cops on me, not knowing I was the sheriff. She declared war on country life while choosing to live in the country. She wanted to bring HOA madness to a place that still ran on respect, patience, and the occasional honk from a cow that escaped the fence. The rooster incident would be her legacy. But the rooster was just the beginning. Karen had no idea what she just stepped into. She thought she'd win a war over noise, smells, and chickens, but this farm wasn't just land. It was my family's legacy, and now it was a battlefield. She brought HOA rules to a sheriff's farm, and she was about to learn exactly why that was a very bad idea. 3 days after the chicken incident, things took a strange, almost cartoonish turn. At first, I thought maybe Karen had finally simmered down. Her porch was quiet, no yelling, no clipboard crusades, and no flashlights near my chicken coop. I should have known better. The calm was fake. A silence before the HOA storm. She wasn't done. She was just gearing up for round 2, and this time, she decided to hit me where it really hurt. Paperwork. I was sipping coffee on my porch when the first of them arrived. A bright pink envelope stuck to my barn door with duct tape, titled Formal Violation #1, and Non-Compliance Scarecrow Proportions. I laughed out loud. Apparently, according to Karen's revised guidelines, all scarecrows must maintain a uniform aesthetic to avoid offending the neighborhood's visual balance. Mine had a football helmet and overalls. Too chaotic, she claimed. That was only the beginning. Over the next few hours, I received 8 more violations. 1 for excessive rooster enthusiasm, 1 for tractor placement during sunrise hours, and 1 for unauthorized weather vanes. I didn't even own a weather vane. I knew then that she wasn't just being a pain. She was trying to build a paper trail, setting me up for forced compliance or some legal maneuver. I wasn't worried, not exactly, but I wasn't going to play defense either. I started documenting everything. I took pictures of my property, recorded videos of my routines, and kept every single one of her violations filed and scanned. I wanted a solid record, something I could drop on a judge's desk if needed. Later that evening, Hank came by with his dog Rex and a 6-pack of his homebrew. He looked more amused than angry, holding one of the same pink envelopes. Apparently, Karen had fined him for allowing unsupervised lawn flamingos to congregate, a reference to the 4 plastic birds he'd set out for decoration. He showed me another violation where she claimed his wind chimes were aggressively melodic. We laughed so hard Rex barked at us, but the conversation turned serious when Hank said the HOA board was too intimidated to intervene. Karen had been claiming she was acting under emergency authority due to the deteriorating rural standards of the community. It was complete nonsense, but people were afraid to argue. She knew just enough legal language to sound convincing and just enough crazy to be dangerous. That night, I stayed up late reading through the HOA charter. It was ancient and barely legible in spots, but it had one golden rule. The HOA president must be elected by majority vote. Karen hadn't been voted in. She had declared herself interim president after claiming the last guy, Ben, had verbally appointed her before moving out. Ben had actually left because Karen harassed his wife about unfriendly curtain patterns. I texted Ben, and he confirmed it. He never appointed her. In fact, he'd warned the HOA via email that she was power-hungry and nuts. That was my first real weapon. The next day, I visited a few neighbors. Some were nervous to talk at first. Karen had already fined them for things like unpermitted mailbox color and improper dog tail wagging during quiet hours. But once they realized I wasn't there to arrest them or hand out more violations, they opened up. Turns out almost everyone hated her. They'd just been waiting for someone to stand up. I promised them this wouldn't be a brawl in the dirt. It would be legal, professional, and surgical. I wasn't just going to stop Karen. I was going to expose her. While I worked on organizing an emergency HOA meeting, Karen escalated again. This time, it was personal. I woke up to find my mailbox, my actual, government-issued, legally protected mailbox, torn out again. In its place was a white and gold monstrosity bolted into the ground and reading, "Karen Mail Only, HOA Communications Hub." I stared at it for a long time, completely speechless. This wasn't just ridiculous anymore. It was federal-level stupidity. I filed an official report on the mailbox tampering, logged it with the county, and took crystal-clear photos. Then I set up a hidden camera on the property's edge. I didn't expect anything that first night, but around 2:30 a.m., movement triggered the alert. I opened the app, and there she was in her pink robe and slippers, sneaking around with a notepad and measuring tape, pacing around my tractor. She stopped, bent down, and planted a small wooden stake into the dirt with a flag on it that said "Zone Violation." The footage was gold. Later that week, I compiled all the evidence: the mailbox incident, the night trespassing, the false HOA appointment, and the recorded 911 calls she made on me. I even had a voice memo from her telling Hank that she was going to push the sheriff until he cracked or moved. I packaged it all neatly and prepared to present it at the HOA emergency meeting. The night of the meeting arrived, and I walked in wearing plain clothes. No badge, no uniform, just a man with a binder. Karen was already there, standing at the head of the table like she owned it, smiling smugly. Her supporters were few, mostly people who just wanted to avoid drama. The rest looked ready for change. Karen opened with a speech about how the rural chaos had reached unacceptable levels and how she'd worked tirelessly to bring order. She cited her numerous violations issued, claimed the farm properties were bringing down the neighborhood's visual property value, and ended with the statement, "I have sacrificed my sanity to protect yours." That was my cue. I stood up, walked to the front, and calmly laid my binder on the table. I began reading through each piece of evidence, calmly and clearly, letting the ridiculousness of her actions speak for itself. I passed around the letter from Ben, played the night vision video of her sneaking around my tractor, and showed everyone the mailbox footage. Then I ended with the HOA charter clause requiring a voted president and asked the room a simple question: "Who here voted for Karen?" Not a single hand went up. Karen's face crumbled. She turned pale, then red, then pale again. She stammered something about emergency power, but no one was listening anymore. Hank stood up and said, "I motion to remove Karen as interim president, effective immediately, and open nominations for a legal vote." It was unanimous as people clapped and nodded. Karen snapped. She shouted, "You'll regret this." "I'm not finished. I'll call the state. I'll call the news," and stormed out. A paper fell out of her binder. It was titled Phase 2, Farm Cleanup Mandate. Someone picked it up, glanced at it, and laughed. It was mostly hand-drawn pictures of barns with red X's and a giant rooster with devil horns. Outside, I stood by my truck and watched the stars for a while. It had been a long day, and the war wasn't over yet, but I'd taken the first step. I knew Karen wasn't going to give up easily. People like her never do. But now the town knew the truth. The facade had cracked, and as I climbed into the truck and drove off into the night, I smiled, already planning my next move. The morning after Karen's dramatic HOA death running, the entire neighborhood felt different. For the first time in weeks, people were smiling again. Hank waved from his porch without holding a pink citation. Even Mrs. Simmons, who hadn't spoken much since Karen fined her for having too many ceramic frogs, offered me a plate of muffins. But peace in Karen's world was never a permanent setting. I knew she wasn't done. When someone like Karen loses perceived power, they don't retreat. They reload. By mid-afternoon, her car was gone from the driveway, but not for long. She returned with a vengeance and a stack of new paperwork. Rumors spread fast. Karen was seen in town visiting a lawyer, handing over a thumb drive, then stopping at the county building demanding public records. According to a clerk who called me discreetly, she'd asked for every citation, violation, and complaint ever filed on my property. She was digging for dirt, convinced that if she couldn't run me out with HOA rules, she'd find something official to nail me with. Later that day, a letter showed up taped to my fence. No postage, just tape. It was an official-looking document with a letterhead from a law office I'd never heard of. Karen was threatening a civil suit for emotional trauma caused by my rooster's relentless psychological attacks. She claimed the sound of crowing triggered her anxiety and caused her to relive the stress of urban car alarms. I nearly dropped my coffee laughing. I called the number listed and got a junior associate who sounded about 12. He explained that Ms. Karen had hired their office to explore agricultural noise nuisance litigation. I asked if they were aware that the man she was threatening to sue was also the sheriff of the county. There was a long pause, followed by a nervous chuckle, then a promise to get back to me. They never did. The next escalation wasn't legal. It was petty and somehow worse. Karen began handing out flyers, not just to my neighbors, but at the local farmers market, church bulletin boards, even the bait shop. The flyers were bright yellow, featuring an unflattering picture of me mid-sneeze at the town chili cook-off and the words, "Is this man endangering our community?" followed by a list of accusations ranging from allowing livestock to roam freely to weaponizing poultry. I took one look and knew this wasn't about rules anymore. It was a personal crusade. I knew I had to respond, but I wanted to do it in a way that Karen wouldn't see coming. So I decided it was time to host a community gathering. I called it Farm Day, a casual event with food, games, and a tour of the property. I wanted people to see the truth with their own eyes, not just about me, but about what real farm life looked like. No hidden agendas, just families, animals, and fresh pie. Flyers went out, invites were printed, and within days I had over 30 rest-ups. But I also knew Karen wouldn't just stay home. She'd come, and she'd come loaded with something. I prepared. The day of the event was perfect. Clear sky, warm breeze, and the smell of barbecue in the air. People wandered in with kids and lawn chairs. Hank brought his home brew, and Mrs. Stimmons set up a lemonade stand. The kids loved the animals. Rusty the rooster, ironically, was a star. People took selfies with him, and someone even made a sticker that said Team Rusty. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly. At exactly 2:17 p.m., Karen arrived. She stepped out of her car wearing a pantsuit like she was going to court and holding a megaphone. She didn't even make it 5 feet before shouting, "This gathering is illegal. There are livestock safety violations and unsanitary practices occurring on this property." Everyone turned. Some kids stopped mid-corn dog. She marched straight to the chicken coop, camera rolling, narrating like she was filming a documentary. Observe the aggression in the eyes of this rooster. This is a public safety crisis waiting to happen. I walked over and calmly reminded her she was on private property and, more importantly, unwelcome. She waved her papers in my face and said, "I'm here to gather evidence. My attorney is very interested in your fencing standards." At that point, a cow mooed loudly, as if on cue. A few people laughed. Someone clapped. Karen spun around and shouted, "This is not funny. This is harassment." I had 2 deputies there, off duty, just enjoying the food, and one of them stepped forward. He politely told her she needed to leave, or she'd be trespassing. Karen narrowed her eyes at him, then at me, then at everyone who wasn't backing her up. She looked around at the cheerful families, the happy animals, and the total lack of sympathy. Then she did the most Karen thing possible. She called 911. Right there, standing in the middle of Farm Day, she dialed the emergency number and told the operator she was being held hostage on a hostile property run by a rogue sheriff using farm animals as a militia. I heard it with my own ears. Her voice was loud enough to echo across the barnyard. The operator, likely already familiar with her antics, must have patched the call through to dispatch. A few minutes later, my department called my personal line to check in, clearly amused. I told them everything was under control. Karen was escorted back to her car and warned again about trespassing. But before she drove off, she rolled down the window and shouted, "You're going to regret humiliating me. This town deserves better leadership than a man who lets chickens run wild." Then she sped off, nearly taking out a decorative hay bale in the process. After she left, something unexpected happened. People didn't just shrug it off. They rallied. I saw a different kind of energy in the neighbors, solidarity. Hank raised a toast and said, "To Sheriff Jackson, Farm Day, and Rusty, our emotional support rooster." The place erupted in laughter. That night, people stayed longer than expected. The sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows over the fields, and I realized something important. Karen might not be finished, but she was losing. Not because I had a badge or a binder full of evidence, but because no one believed her anymore. Her power was in the illusion of authority, and now that was gone. But then came the real twist. The next morning, a courier dropped off an envelope at my gate. Inside was a court notice. Karen was suing me for emotional distress, property value sabotage, and mental fatigue induced by agricultural malpractice. Attached was a letter from her lawyer stating the court date had been set. This wasn't over. Karen had gone from HOA bully to full-on courtroom warrior. But what she didn't know was that I had something even stronger than law on my side. I had the town. I had the truth. And I had video footage of her calling a chicken a terrorist. The courthouse smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper, and as I walked through the front doors with my boots echoing on the tile floor, I couldn't help but smirk. The situation had spiraled into something so absurd it felt like a sketch comedy, only now it was happening under fluorescent lights and under oath. Karen had followed through on her threat and filed a civil lawsuit. According to the documents, I was personally responsible for causing her emotional destabilization, daily psychological distress, and auditory assault, all through the actions of my rooster, my tractor, and even the layout of my garden. I kid you not, she included an aerial photo of my cornrows and claimed the pattern was intentionally chaotic and mentally disruptive. I sat quietly at the defense table with a file folder full of printouts, photos, security cam stills, and a few selected witness statements from neighbors who'd suffered under Karen's reign. Meanwhile, Karen arrived late, wearing a neck brace and oversized sunglasses, like she was auditioning for a role in a legal drama. She walked in limping dramatically, holding her back, and paused at the courtroom entrance so everyone could see her pained expression. Her attorney, a young guy with too much gel in his hair, carried a wheeled briefcase that seemed bigger than him. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who didn't have time for nonsense, looked at Karen with a long pause before saying, "Ma'am, I assume you're prepared to demonstrate evidence of this rooster-related trauma." Karen nodded like her head was made of glass and whispered something to her attorney. He stood up, cleared his throat, and began his opening argument about how my farm's unregulated rural behaviors had caused his client undue mental suffering and worsened her urban sensory fatigue. The courtroom was completely silent, not from respect, but confusion. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then came the so-called evidence. Karen played a video from her phone of my rooster crowing at dawn. That was it, just Rusty doing what roosters do. Then she submitted a printed log titled Rooster Activity Journal, with entries like 5:41 a.m., auditory trauma, 6 seconds, and 6:12 a.m., crowing in aggressive tone. I thought the judge might choke on her coffee. She then claimed she couldn't sleep, that her blood pressure was elevated, and she was developing pieces from the constant sounds of rural life. At one point, she even pointed at me and said, "He weaponized the countryside against me." You could feel the tension in the room trying not to burst into laughter. Then it was my turn. I stood up, handed the judge a packet of documents, and began methodically dismantling her case. First, I showed the video footage of her trespassing, standing outside my chicken coop in the middle of the night, trying to provoke Rusty into crowing. Next, I presented the report from a veterinarian who confirmed Rusty was 11 years old and partially deaf, and that most of the crowing Karen recorded didn't even come from him. I admitted I had once played a recording of rooster sounds through a Bluetooth speaker for a few mornings, just to mess with her after she called 911 on me. I let the court know I had documented that too, and the recording was a publicly available farm sound loop called Country Sunrise. The judge looked at Karen, then back at me, and asked if she was actually suing a sheriff over a rooster that didn't crow. I replied, technically, she's suing me for her interpretation of a rooster crowing and its effect on her city-worn sensibilities. The courtroom let out a soft ripple of laughter. Karen objected. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled both. Things went downhill fast for Karen after that. I introduced character statements from Hank and Mrs. Simmons, who testified about her fake cetaceans, her harassment tactics, and the time she fined a child for splashing too loudly in a kiddie pool. I even had a witness describe the Stop Chicken Crimes protest she organized in Town Square, which only 3 people attended, and one thought was a food truck festival. Then came the counterclaim. My attorney walked up and calmly stated that we were filing a suit against Karen for harassment, trespassing, destruction of federal property, defamation, and emotional damages due to her false accusations and community disruption. We requested damages equivalent to every hour wasted and every repair made due to her actions. The judge leaned back and said, "Well, now things are getting interesting." Karen started unraveling right there in court. She stood up, pointed at me, and screamed that the town was conspiring against her, that the entire zip code was a cult of farm animals and dirty boots. She accused the judge of bias, accused her own lawyer of being unprepared, and yelled that Rusty had malicious eyes. Her attorney buried his face in his hands. The judge had had enough. She dismissed Karen's claim on the spot for lack of merit, declared that the court would move forward with reviewing my counterclaim, and informed Karen that she'd need to prepare for a hearing to explain her actions, including the mailbox tampering incident, which I reminded everyone was a federal offense. Karen went pale. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper asked me for a statement. I just said, some folks move to the country looking for peace and quiet. Some move in thinking they can control it. One of those paths ends better than the other. The quote ran front page the next morning under the headline, "Sheriff Defeats Chicken Lawsuit." But that wasn't the end. The real win came later that week when I got a knock on my office door. It was the county supervisor. He handed me a folder and said, "Thought you'd want to see this." Inside was an application Karen had filed requesting to be recognized as an environmental noise impact advisor for the state. It had been rejected with a handwritten note. Applicant lacks understanding of basic wildlife behavior and appropriate social conduct. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Karen somehow still lived at the edge of the neighborhood, though the for sale sign on her lawn had been there for over a month. No buyers yet. Word gets around. Her lawn, once pristine, was now patchy and wild. She didn't glare at me anymore. She didn't wave. She just stood behind her curtains, watching, waiting, maybe plotting something new. But at that point, I wasn't worried. I had the law, the town, and one very old rooster who couldn't care less. The courtroom drama had been the peak of Karen's rampage, but now that she'd lost, the fallout would be slow, embarrassing, and utterly public. She tried to silence the countryside, but in doing so, all she did was amplify her own ridiculousness. And somehow, through the noise and nonsense, that dusty little courtroom became the place where the whole town got closure. A month had passed since the courtroom circus, and the town had more or less gone back to normal. Our version of normal, anyway. Tractors hummed in the distance, kids raced their bikes down gravel roads, and roosters, yes, including Rusty, continued to crow at ungodly hours without fear of lawsuit. Karen, on the other hand, had become a ghost. Her porch lights stayed off. Her trash bins overflowed. The woman who once patrolled the neighborhood with clipboards and binoculars now barely stepped off her porch. Every time someone drove by, her curtains twitched. Her reign was over, and everyone knew it, but no one forgot what she'd done. Her flyers still popped up in odd places, yellow and crinkled now, mostly used to wrap cat litter or start barbecue fires. The infamous "Is this man endangering our community?" poster with my sneezing face had actually become a meme among local teens. One kid wore a shirt with that print to the county fair, and I didn't even mind. It was so over the top, so Karen, it had become folklore. The community, now fully free of her threats and fake citations, began bouncing back with energy. The HOA board, recently purged of Karen's influence, held an actual election. This time, they invited me to the meeting, and though I had no interest in running, Hank nominated me anyway. I laughed it off, but then every hand in the room went up. No one else wanted the job. I sighed, stood up, and said, "Fine, but only if I get to install a scarecrow named Karen in the HOA flower bed." Everyone roared. The motion passed unanimously, and just like that, I became the new HOA president, something I never thought I'd do but figured it was safer than letting another lunatic sneak in. That very weekend, we held a small neighborhood celebration on my farm to mark the return of common sense. We roasted corn, had pony rides for the kids, and even set up a dunk tank with a cardboard cutout of Karen taped to the target. Hank had drawn it by hand. It had lipstick, an angry frown, and said "comply or cry" across the chest. The kids loved it. Someone brought matching stickers. By the end of the day, we were all sunburned, full, and laughing under the string lights. It had felt over, but part of me knew Karen wasn't done. People like her didn't go quietly. I just didn't know what form her last gasp of crazy would take. I found out one morning when I went to retrieve my mail and saw something new stapled to the community notice board at the entrance of the neighborhood. It was a freshly printed flyer, this one in bright red, titled "Citizens Against Rural Recklessness." Underneath was Karen's full name, a new photo of her holding a miniature American flag, and a poorly formatted mission statement about fighting back against the tyranny of unregulated farmland. Apparently, Karen had started her own protest group. The only problem was she was the only member. Her first meeting was scheduled for Sunday at 3:00 p.m. in her driveway. Nobody showed up, not even the raccoon that used to knock over her trash bin. The next day, she stood out there alone, holding a sign that said "Silence the chickens," while wearing noise-canceling headphones. She lasted 20 minutes before going back inside, defeated. Someone took a picture, posted it online, and within hours, it was trending in our town's Facebook group under the tag hashtag #FreeTheRooster. The internet had taken her legacy and twisted it into something she could never control. For a woman obsessed with order, that had to be pure torment. Then came the final nail in the coffin. A real estate agent, a friend of mine from high school, stopped by my place and told me Karen had officially listed her house. Apparently, the constant stares, the public embarrassment, and the viral memes had taken their toll. She wanted out. But selling a house where you've become the most hated figure in the county wasn't exactly easy. No one wanted to live next to the infamous Rooster lady. Her first buyer backed out after finding out the property line faced my coop. Her second walked off during the tour when a kid on a bike shouted, "Hey Karen, the Rooster says hi," from down the road. Eventually, she gave up on selling and decided to rent. And in a twist of poetic justice I never could have scripted, the first tenants she found were a punk rock band. They called themselves the Angry Scarecrows and practiced in the garage 5 nights a week. I drove by once and saw them rehearsing in full costume, complete with straw hats and fake beaks. Their lead singer introduced himself as Rusty, named after my rooster, and their first single was Crowbreaker. I didn't even have the heart to be mad. The noise was awful, but it was the kind of awful that made you laugh. Karen tried to shut them down, of course, called the cops multiple times. The department, fully aware of the irony, responded with the same professionalism she never offered. She was told firmly that she had no grounds to complain about noise coming from a property she didn't own anymore. She stood in her driveway, defeated, clutching a mug that read "Retired HOA Queen," and watching as her once silent castle became a garage of chaos. As for me, life got sweeter. My farm thrived, the animals were happy, and Rusty was treated like a celebrity. Someone even printed a children's book called Rusty Beats the Bullies, and the local library hosted a reading. I got invited to speak at a town council meeting about HOA reform and how to deal with rogue leadership. I started getting mail from nearby counties asking for advice. Apparently, Karen types weren't exclusive to our zip code. But the best part? Peace. Real, honest, dirt under your nails kind of peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did things the right way. No shouting matches, no sneaky revenge, just law, truth, and a little bit of country stubbornness. I never set out to teach Karen a lesson, but sometimes people write their own endings, and all you have to do is stand back and let the ink dry. On the last day before she finally packed up and moved out for good, I saw her one final time. She stood by the fence line, staring at the coop, clutching a suitcase. Rusty crowed, weak, scratchy, but still proud. She closed her eyes, sighed, and muttered something I couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked to her car without looking back. I watched her drive off until the dust cloud disappeared. Then I turned to Rusty and said, "Well, partner, that's that." He blinked once and pecked at a worm like nothing had happened. And just like that, the farm was mine again. No more pink cetaceans, no more megaphones. Just the morning sun, the smell of fresh hay, and the freedom to live loud, laugh harder, and let the rooster crow as early and as often as he damn well pleased.